Hey everybody, what's up? This is Mr. Nixon coming to you live from Austin, Texas. I'm here for an international conference known as the NISOD conference. Um, Learning a lot of great stuff about teaching and learning, development, leadership, the whole gambit and all that. I'll probably tell you guys more about it when I get back. But what I did want to do is I did want to take some time out tonight, kind of put together um, a little video to kind of discuss some of the concepts that you're probably looking at with tissue chapter. Now, I know most of you have probably used tissue chapters to solve your problem with not being able to go to sleep. You probably have fallen asleep 2 or 3 times reading that chapter because of just how the material really is. But don't worry, I'm going to go through some of the material with you tonight. Probably go through and make another video again to hit on some more attributes about the tissues later on this week and see what we can solve. Really, tonight, I don't want to try to go through the whole PowerPoint because that'll probably put you to sleep too. But what I really want to do is I want to hit on some very initial key concepts of tissues, and then I want to talk about one particular class of tissues, which is epithelial tissue. Generally, I think the 2 tissues that people wrestle with the most with as far as understanding them is epithelial tissue and connective tissue. So let's plan on talking about epithelial tissue now. And then in a couple of days we'll talk about connective tissue. Let's work on that. So without any further ado, let me change the screenshot so that you guys can see what I'm seeing. I'm going to pull up this PowerPoint here. We're going to get started with slide number 2. How about that? And for most of you guys, you're probably celebrating Memorial Day. I hope Memorial Day is going good for you, and I look forward to hearing all about whatever you grilled. Me, myself, out here in Austin, I had some fatty brisket, beef brisket. So for those of you who don't get down with barbecue, shame on you. Shame, shame, shame. All right, so let's get started. Now, I think slide number 2 really gets into talking about tissue organization, and really what that means is basically, you know, when you talk about a tissue, it means that you've got a group of cells that are working together towards a common goal. That is a tissue. So when you go to the hospital and they tell you, oh, we want to take a tissue sample, really what they're saying is they want to take a group of cells and they want to look more in depth at what that group of cells is actually doing. That's why they take a tissue sample or they have a tissue culture. Because remember, you should have been learning about this in your lab. You know, you have an individual cell, and cells are alive, and they have different functions. But then when you take a group of cells and put them together, and they start working together, then they make a tissue. Well, if you take a group of tissues, and those tissues work together, then they make an organ. And of course, if you take several organs and put them together, and they start working together, you make an organ system. And if you take all 11 organ systems, slap them together, you make a human being. When I think about a tissue, this is what I think of. Let's say, okay, everybody, we met one another that first Monday night. So let's think about it. Think about everybody that's in your lab on Monday night. All of those people in that lab, each individual is a cell. And the room that you guys meet in for lab, if you include all the chairs that you guys sit in, the tables that you're using, and all the people that are in that lab, all of that stuff, the tables, the chairs, and the people, all of them put together make a tissue. And that's because you're all together there for one common goal. So when we talk about a tissue, 2 things you have absolutely, positively have to remember about this tissue chapter. Because trust me, this is going to follow you all the way through to 10, all the way through to 11. 2 things you have to remember about tissues. Number 1, pay close attention to the cells involved. Because if you can learn what cells are involved or the attributes of the cells that are involved, you'll have this tissue thing down pat. You'll remember the stuff in the upcoming test and it won't be as hard. The second thing you always need to remember about a tissue is that the functions of the cells are going to lend to the function of the tissue. All right, and I'm going to say that again. The function of the cells are going to lend to the function of the tissue. I'll give you an example. Let's say that you go to a restaurant, you sit down and eat, and about 10 guys walk in. And all 10 of these guys are over the height of 6'5". All of them. You would look at all of those tall guys, and the first thing that would come to your mind is, gee whiz, I wonder if they play, yeah, you got it. I wonder if they play basketball. You would ask if they play basketball based off of the fact that they were all very tall. Then later on, you probably bump into one of them at the salad bar and you talk to them and you find out that no, really, all 10 of them are part of a basketball team. Now, they make a basketball team not because one of them are tall, but because of all of them being tall, and they all work together towards a common goal. And you get a chance to see their function. They function as a basketball team because of the individuals that are there. A tissue is the exact same way. If you go through trying to memorize tissues just to memorize them for the sake of the lab exam, that is perfectly fine, whatever floats your boat. But what you have to understand is when you go to apply that material, you need to know what type of cells are involved, or it's going to sink your ship. So down at the bottom of slide 2, you'll see that it says that you have 4 types of tissues: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. Those are 4 major types of tissues. And if you've gone through these slides already, then you have probably already noticed that about 28, 27, 28 slides out of this entire slideshow is all dedicated to epithelial tissue. A whole giant chunk is dedicated to connective tissue, and then there's hardly anything on nervous and muscle tissue. And I'm going to tell you why. Because muscle tissue actually gets its entire own chapter. And so if you've been longing and yearning for some learning of some muscle tissue, oh, trust me, don't worry. We got a whole chapter dedicated to muscle tissue. And you'll also notice that we take 2 weeks to go over that stuff, and it's got its own lecture test. So brace yourself for that. And nervous tissue has its own chapter. And guess what? You notice that I give you the entire break to get some time to go over that nervous tissue before you take the test on that. Because both of those 2 tissues are so interwoven into our day-to-day lives, they make that much of an impact on the other organ systems. So we need that much time to actually go into those 2 tissues. Epithelial and connective tissues, they are more of our structural tissues. They are more of the tissues that make up our body's framework. Muscle tissue helps you move, hands down. But when you break down muscle tissue, you find out there's 3 different types of muscle tissue. There's cardiac muscle tissue that's located in your heart. There's smooth muscle tissue that's located in hollow organs like your stomach and your small intestine. And then, of course, you've got skeletal muscle tissue, which is the stuff that makes your body move. Then you've got nervous tissue, which is primarily your brain and your spinal cord and your nerves. So those guys have multiple chapters that we have to discuss as we go through the semester. But epithelial tissue and connective tissue, neither one of them are going to have their own chapters. Epithelial tissue and connective tissue are integrated throughout the body. So we have to take all the time out to talk about them now. So let's skip ahead to this slide where we start talking about epithelial tissue and its origin. And epithelial tissue, remember what I said earlier, that tissues are nothing more than groups of cells working together towards a common goal. So if that is the case, then where do these cells come from? Well, all of your epithelial cells originate as what we call stem cells. Think of a stem cell as a blank canvas. It's like you show up to painting class and the canvas is completely blank and you've got tons of paint and markers, and you now have the opportunity to create whatever you want to create on that canvas. That's kind of like what a stem cell is. A stem cell has not differentiated. In other words, it has not become a specified thing. For example, when you're in college, you can have a major. And that's great that you've got a major. But according to the college itself, really you're just a college student. I mean, yeah, we track you and everything. We say this is your major. That's the program you're going to go into. But generally, really, I mean, when you do your taxes, there's nothing that says, you know, check your major while you're in college. There's nothing like that. You don't see that. Instead, we just refer to you as a college student, and that's that. A stem cell is the same way. You can have a bone stem cell, you can have a heart muscle stem cell, you can have skin stem cells. That's all great and wonderful, but until it differentiates, in other words, until it gets a specified job description, until it gets a specified positioning, then that stem cell is just a stem cell until it differentiates and then becomes a specific type of cell. So what winds up happening with epithelial tissue is those cells, they differentiate. In other words, they undergo mitosis. If you've never heard of mitosis before, that's cell division. That's basically when you take a stem cell and he splits into two equal cells, and then one of those two equal cells will continue on the family practice or the family business and become another stem cell. While the second cell differentiates, he transforms and becomes a specified type of cell. And so we look here at some of the functions of epithelial tissue. You know, it covers the body surfaces, it lines body cavities, forms the majority of glands. Do you notice that it's covering and lining a lot of stuff? All right, it covers and lines a lot of things. Epithelial tissue is all about protection. That's what it does. It's all about protection. And the second thing you probably want to jot down if you're taking notes is that epithelial tissue is all about making a barrier. So it's all about protection and it's all about making a barrier. That's why when you look at the locations of epithelial tissue, they're always lining something or covering something. You got epithelial tissue on the superficial layer of your skin. You've got epithelial tissue lining the inside of your digestive tract. You got epithelial tissue lining the inside of your nasal cavity. You got epithelial tissue lining the inside of your oral cavity. You have epithelial tissue covering and protecting everywhere around your body, especially structures or orifices or canals that lead to the outside environment. That's just what epithelial tissue does. You notice down at the bottom, there's three really key characteristics about epithelial tissue. Number one, you can have one or more closely packed cells, so they stack on top of one another, kind of like Lego bricks. And then number two, they contain little or no extracellular matrix. What in the world does that mean? In other words, the cells are so tightly packed together that there's very little room for you to actually put any fluid or any other substance in between the cells. So it's just like looking at a brick wall. If you look at a brick wall, there's very little space in between the bricks, just the mortar. And they contain no blood vessels. So you know what that tells me? That tells me the epithelial tissue is avascular. Avascular. A-V-A-S-C-U-L-A-R. Avascular. In other words, for those of you who have taken medical terminology or you're taking med terms, then you already know that when you put the letter A in front of a word, it means without. So when you put the letter A in front of a word, that means without. So when you say avascular, A means without, vascular means blood vessels. So avascular means without blood vessels. Epithelial tissue has no blood vessels in it. So let's play with something a little bit. You'll probably figure this out in your lab as well. When you look at the skin, you'll find that the most superficial layer, and you notice I keep throwing around that word superficial because you guys should have been looking at this terminology in lab already. Superficial versus deep, inferior versus exterior, all that stuff. But when you look at someone's skin, the most superficial layer to it is the epidermis, which is made up of layers of epithelium. When you look underneath the epidermis, you have the dermis, which the dermis is made out of connective tissue. Now, the epidermis, the most superficial layer of your skin, is made out of epithelial tissue. It's avascular. It doesn't have blood vessels in it. When I was in high school in 10th grade, in my biology class, we used to sit in the back, and me and this guy named James and this other guy named John, and no, there was no Peter, so don't even go there with that. But me and this guy named James and this other guy named John, we used to sit back there with sticky pins. And we used to stick the sticky pins through the skin in our fingers. And have you ever seen that? People do that in school. You stick the sticky pins through your skin and see who can get the sticky pin the deepest without actually bleeding, and then walk around with a sticky pin sticking out of your fingers. We would do that. Without fail, somebody would turn around and wind up pricking themselves, and they wind up bleeding all over the place. So the crazy thing about that was the fact that we realized that the epidermis is made out of epithelial tissue. There's no blood vessels in it. So you can stick a sticky pin in it and look all freakish and everything and freak everybody out in the back of the lab. But if you go too deep, you wind up hitting the dermis, which is the connective tissue, and that has blood vessels in it. And so you wind up bleeding. Now, this is just a brief review of the epithelial, different types of epithelial tissue. You'll see simple squamous, simple cuboidal, non-ciliated simple columnar, ciliated simple columnar. There's lots of different types, and you'll notice that the biggest difference between all of these different epithelial tissues, like this row and the next row, the biggest difference is their shape and how many layers of the actual cell there are. Like, for example, this whole page that you're looking at, everything's simple, which means that there are only one layer of cells. And the structure defines the function. Remember, we learned that in chapter 1, structure defines function. I told you about the little kid that came over to my birthday party at my house and walked around with the screwdriver, taking the screws out of the light fixtures all around the house. Yeah, he figured out that structure defined function. He knew exactly what that thing was. He knew that that was a screwdriver, and what made it even freakier was the fact that he figured out exactly what size screwdriver was fitting those screws to take them out of all of my light fixtures. He understood that structure defined function. He did not take the screwdriver and try to use it as a hammer. So these cells, you can look at their shape. Their shape defines what they do. So like for the first one, the simple squamous epithelium, I would not expect simple squamous epithelium to be there for protection. You know, that's not for security, dude. You don't want that. All right? Because those things are so flat and they're so thin, and there's only one layer to them. So it would be easy for things to diffuse across them. And that's exactly why you have simple squamous epithelium in your lungs, lining your alveoli, because you want oxygen in and you want carbon dioxide out, and you need something that's flat enough, thin enough, with enough surface area to allow oxygen to come into your body and carbon dioxide to freely go out. So that's why you would have simple squamous epithelium. Simple meaning one layer, squamous meaning flat. And as you continue to go through this list, you'll notice that each one of these guys is very specified in their shape and how many layers there actually are. And it dictates their function and their location, which is very important. Now, I want you to look at this page real close. You're probably seeing some words that you've seen before, but they mean totally different things here. And that kind of throws people for a minute, and I can understand. Like cellularity. The last time I probably heard cellularity, I mean, honestly, outside of this class, hearing cellularity, I heard it in a cell phone commercial. So that really throws people off because they're looking at it and they're like, I saw that. That was a Verizon commercial. No. We're not talking Verizon here. We're just talking about epithelial cells. Cellularity composed almost entirely of tightly packed cells. In other words, epithelial tissue has a high regard of cellularity because when you look at epithelial tissue, there's almost nothing but cells. You don't have an extracellular matrix. There's no gooey stuff. There's no extra protein fibers in there. These cells aren't building anything. They are what they are. They just stack on top of one another and they do what they do. Polarity. Polarity is just simply saying that, you know, the thing has a top and a bottom. I mean, that's what polarity means. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're like, wait a minute, no, that's not what it means. You know, I just went to see that X-Men movie. I know what polarity means. I mean, Magneto was my boy. No. We're not talking about polarity and things like that. If you have problems remembering what polarity means in reference to body tissues, think of it this way. When you have a battery, like let's just say you get a random battery that you go to put in the remote control at your home. that battery has a positive end and a negative end, and usually you say the positive end is the top and the negative end is the bottom. And you talk about the polarity or the poles, the polar ends. All right. Well, polarity, you have polarity of cells because epithelial cells have a top and they have a bottom. The top surface, the apical surface, is the one that actually is exposed to the outside environment. So that's the one that gets hit. So in your mouth, when you wash your mouth out with mouthwash, that mouthwash is sloshing against the apical surface of your epithelial cells. But the basal surface, the basal, like a basement, it connects to the bottom. That's the part that connects the epithelial tissue to the connective tissue that's sitting below. Usually that layer that's allowing the epithelial tissue to connect to the connective tissue is known as a basement membrane. Doesn't mean much to people until they wind up falling and scraping their elbow or their knee, and it winds up removing that epithelial tissue from the connective tissue. Yeah. So if you got like some kids or whatever, and one of those kids have fallen and scraped their knee, and you see the gooey stuff when they scrape their knee, that's part of that basement membrane that was holding the epithelial tissue attached to that connective tissue. Not pleasant, but hey, what can I say? And there's avascularity, talking about the epithelial tissue being avascular, which we talked about already. They talk about the fact that it has extensive innervation. In other words, your epithelial tissue is usually carrying pockets of receptors, nerve receptors, sensory receptors to be specific. So you've got sensory receptors with some of everything from temperature receptors that's, respond to hot, that respond to cold. You've got sensory receptors that respond to touch. You've got sensory receptors that respond to pressure. They just kind of let your body know what's going on the surface. And the last one is high regeneration capacity. In other words, when you go to take a shower or you use a salt scrub or a sugar scrub, you're scrubbing off the top layer. You're scrubbing off the epithelial cells. Remember, epithelial cells, they don't have blood vessels, thank goodness, because otherwise you'd go get a facial scrub and your face will wind up bleeding all over the place. But also another thing that throws people off, they're like, well, wait a minute, you just said that you got extensive innervation, which means that you got sensory receptors. So what about pain receptors and things like that? Yeah, you do, but those receptors, they press into the epithelial tissue. Not all of those receptors exist in the areas of epithelial tissue that we've discussed so far. We're going to have to really get down to the nitty-gritty of where those receptors are actually located. When you start thinking of pressure receptors and pain receptors in the skin, they're actually in the dermis, and they project into the epidermis, so they're not really in the epithelial tissue of the epidermis. But when you go to do a salt scrub, you remove that outer layer, that superficial layer of epithelial cells right off. But you can replace those things easy. That's why you have to exfoliate. Let's move a little further in. Let's talk a little more about some of these functions here. I just want to make sure we hammer this home. And if you guys got any questions, just hit me back. You can post some questions here on Google Plus, or you can shoot me an email about some of these. We're going to start having some open discussion and open a little chat room time as we get a little further into some of these other chapters. But some of the other general functions of epithelial tissue, I mentioned the first one already. I was talking about acting as a protective barrier. Well, physical protection is the same thing. We usually don't think about epithelial tissue until you lose it. That is the general process of epithelial tissue. It's not the most exciting thing. It's not the thing that you want to, check out and say, oh, let's go take in a movie of epithelial tissue. No, that's not going to happen. That's usually not on your mind. But usually epithelial tissue is one of those things that pops up in the student's mind when they lose it. I remember eating at a friend's house a number of years ago. We used to go over there to get that good, authentic Mexican. And then the thing about it was she's vegetarian, so we had that vegetarian Mexican, which was great. And I remember she made a plate and she mixed up our plates. She used to make me what she called a wuss plate because she knew that I couldn't take the heat. But she loved her stuff hot, so she actually ground up the seeds in her food. And she mixed up our plates because I came over late one day. And I wound up biting into it. And she even herself said that it was too hot for her. And what wound up happening was it burned the top layer off the roof of my mouth. I'll never forget that. I was drinking water and milk, and it was doing nothing for me. Sitting there with a block of ice in my mouth. My mouth was like burned for the next week. But it burned that epithelial layer right off the top of the roof of my mouth and part of the back of my throat. It's great that I had that epithelial layer there because that's all that happened. Can you imagine what would have happened if I had not had that epithelial layer there protecting my mouth and my throat? It would have gotten pretty nasty pretty quick. Another thing that epithelial tissue does is it allows you to have what's called selective permeability. Now, you're going to see selective permeability a little bit in this semester. We don't generally get into a lot of selective permeability in 210. But man, you get to 211 and it just wears you out. You'll be catching selective permeability hits left and right, and they're just going to expect you to understand what that means. When I say that something is selectively permeable, it means that I allow specific things to pass through. All right? I don't let everything pass through, but I'm very selective in who I allow to pass through. That is selective permeability. And epithelial tissue is excellent at allowing you to be able to do that, and it happens all of the time. Have you ever heard of a capillary before? A capillary is a really small blood vessel that has its walls are only 1 cell thick. That's how small a capillary is, and that's how thin the walls are. And the walls are so thin because capillaries are the only way that you can get things in and out of your blood. Believe it or not, here's a trivia fact for you. Are you smarter than a 5th grader type thing? Capillaries are the only locations in your entire cardiovascular system that allows you to get things like oxygen and carbon dioxide in and out, glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, vitamins, minerals. That's the only way you can get them in and out of the blood is at a capillary. So these capillaries, their walls are made completely up of epithelial tissue. And so they selectively allow things to go in and out of the blood vessels themselves. Let's go ahead of this slide just for a minute, and let's talk about something here. And we're going to actually kind of start wrapping this up in a little bit and kind of land this plane. Because getting the glands, this is actually the last thing that I wanted to talk about concerning epithelial tissue. The glands, when you talk about glands are like really weird organs to kind of describe to people. And here's something that I want you to think about. Think of a gland like, I got one for you. All right. Think of a gland like a Ziploc bag. Or better yet, think of a gland like a Ziploc bag, or think of a gland like a pipette bag. Have you ever watched Food Network and you watch Ace of Cakes or something like that? You know how they have the pipette bag, and they use the pipette bags to put cream onto cakes and decorate the cakes. All right. Well, if you imagine that, that's kind of what a gland is. A gland is kind of like a sac or some kind of bag that's made up of cells, and the cells make special secretions, but the secretions are stored in the bag. All right. So let me say that again. Gland is like this magic bag. It's like a pipette bag. And the walls of the pipette bag are made out of these epithelial cells. The epithelial cells secrete. They produce a substance they dump that substance inside of the bag. And so when necessary, you can prompt the bag to release the secretions that the cells made in the first place. And look at that long list of different things that they make: mucin, electrolytes, hormones, enzymes, urea. Oh, trust me, buddy. Believe you me, you're going to have to know all of this. You're not going to escape it. Excuse me. Sipping on some water because my throat is dry out here in Houston, and having to remember that very little humidity whatsoever. But these are things that your body, uses all the time, creates all the time. Some of these things, like urea, is actually a waste product, but the cells make it, and so then they dump it into the lumen or the space of these glands, and then the glands have to be told they excrete this substance. Now, you can read all about glands, all right? I'm not even going to insult your intelligence like that. You can read all about glands. I'm just going to pick and choose a couple of things, and then I'm going to wrap up and talk about a few other things, and then we'll shut this show down. There's two types of glands: endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Some people call them endocrine and exocrine. I could care less. When I was in school, they were called endocrine and exocrine. And then all of a sudden, people really started pushing the other pronunciation. Potato, patata, just call the whole thing a spud, right? You've got two types of glands, and it may not seem like a lot, but trust me, you're going to learn a lot of different types of glands in 210 and 211. The first group of glands are called endocrine glands. Endocrine glands don't have ducts. In other words, when their cells make their secretions and they store them inside the gland, there is no tube for the secretions to get pumped out of the gland into, and there's no tube to actually carry those secretions anywhere. In other words, the secretions are created by the cells in the gland, and then they're just dumped into the body fluids and say, good luck with that. I hope you reach wherever you're trying to go. And these chemical messengers, or these chemicals that these cells are making in the endocrine gland, are called hormones. So any endocrine gland that we learned this semester, and we're going to learn a few, they make hormones. The way they make hormones is you have epithelial cells who make special secretions. They're stored in that endocrine gland, and then when the time is right, the gland releases it. However, an exocrine gland or an exocrine gland, this gland, it's formed with epithelial cells. However, these glands do have a duct, and that duct is a special tube that carries the secretions to a specific location. That's why the examples down there have nothing to do with hormones. Almost nothing to do with hormones anyway, due to the fact that your pancreas is an endocrine organ. But when he makes insulin, the insulin doesn't travel out through a tube. The insulin just kind of gets dumped outside of the cells, and then it gets into your body fluids. But when you start talking about exocrine glands, things like your sweat glands, your cells make the sweat travel through ducts, and then they wind up emptying onto your skin. Now, you can continue reading on. It gets into the nitty-gritty of exocrine and endocrine glands. That's stuff that you can read on your own time. Nothing real deep, nothing major. You start getting into classification of glands, and I'm going to let you read that. What I want to come back and talk to you guys about later is I want to come back and talk to you about connective tissue. Because I talk to people about connective tissue, and they kind of breeze over it. They kind of sort of look at it. Oh, look, it's connective tissue, and then they go on about their business, and then they forget everything that they even bothered to learn about connective tissue. And we got a lot that we need to talk about with connective tissue. So I definitely want to get into that. Don't forget, please, whatever you do, don't forget. Hold on a second, I'm trying to change the screen back. There we go. All right. Don't forget that when you're reading about connective tissue, You need to find out what cells are involved, but you also want to find out what protein fibers are involved and what type of matrix is involved. When you start learning about connective tissue, three things you have to do off the bat and you cannot forget to do. You got to look at what kind of cells are involved. You got to look at what protein fibers are involved, and you got to look at the matrix that's involved. You got to do those three. If you don't do those three with connective tissue, you never really understand why connective tissue works the way that it works, and how you put connective tissue together, and why does some connective tissue work with other connective tissue, and why some connective tissue just seems like it's always by itself. For example, adipose tissue, you need to go look at adipocytes, the cells that make up adipose tissue. And then you want to kind of take your time and look at the fact that adipose tissue can be used for everything from insulation to cushion and buffers. But then when you go and you look at dense connective tissue, you see that you have these fibroblasts that are in there, but you notice that they produce high quantities of not the hold on a second, collagen. Yeah, it makes high levels of it produces high quantities of collagen fibers, and so the collagen fibers are a lot more rigid. They're a lot more resistant to change, and they're more for strength. So you wind up seeing dense connective tissue in structures such as tendons and ligaments, because tendons and ligaments deal with body movement, joints, and skeletal muscle. And so you really need to be able to have that strength and that durability. But that's all I'm going to say for now. I promised that I was going to end, so I'm going to end with that. We'll pick up next time and talk about a little bit of connective tissue. All right, coming to you live from Austin. I'll let you cats later. Peace.